in the Zoom version of this webinar. So welcome everyone. Delighted to have you all with us. My name is Katie Cannon. I'm the Curator of Education at the DAR Museum. And with me, I have John Rees, who is going to be our speaker for today. So this is part of our Tuesday Talk lecture series that is on the second Tuesday of every month, usually. At noon, we have a lecture, either from a curator at the DAR Museum or from a guest. So I hope if you enjoy this one, I hope you will check us out for future events as well. So John Rees is a lifelong resident of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. He's been writing about common soldiers' experiences in the war for American independence for over 30 years on the subjects ranging from women with the Army, food and the soldier's burden, to Army wagons and watercraft, campaign shelters, and Continental Army conscription. He has authored over 150 articles and one book entitled "They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army, 1775 to 1783. And that is also the topic of today's talk. So if you have any questions for John, you who are watching this live, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box that should be around usually the bottom of your screen. And he's going to get to all the questions at the end. So you can type them in anytime you think of them, but then don't worry, he's going to get to all those at the end. So welcome, John. At this point, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really good to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I want to keep my talk to about 45 minutes. I hope that's about it, because I really do want to get to questions in the end. And if not, if we run over a little bit, I'd actually like to give out my email address at the end too. So if you have questions, you can just send them to me by email. Let's see if I can share some screen here. There we go. Okay. Oops. There we go. My presentation, I just want to give a bit of a taste of this complex subject in a relatively short time. I hope to provide some idea of the African-American experience as Continental Army soldiers and followers. I'll boast through my talk a few individual stories and tie together with some insights into soldier numbers. Much of my book is based around African-American soldiers' 19th century pension narratives, where veterans, their friends and relatives tell about the soldier service and often their civilian lives as well. Unless the race is specifically mentioned or references made to them by them or a member of their family being enslaved, most often the reader can't differentiate their account from a white or Native American Continental veteran soldier or story. Unlike the segregated U.S. military of the 19th and 20th centuries, Revolutionary American military units, Continental, meaning regular Army, state and states militia were, with several exceptions, integrated. And in connection with that, I'll speak a bit about the segregated American First Rhode Island Regiment. But I first want to briefly mention the two other largely all-Black regiments that served during the war, and they were not on the American side. The earliest was the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment, formed in 1775 with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia, by Virginia Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore. That unit was disbanded after 1 year. And in March 1777, British Commander-in-Chief in America, Sir William Howe, directed that all Negroes, mulattoes, and other improper persons who have been admitted into the Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. Actually, let's see. I'll give you a little glimpse of what they look like. There you go. That's on the left is when they first joined, and then later on they were actually allotted uniforms. In March 1779, the French military formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue, formed in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment was formed of both free and enslaved black men. The latter were promised their freedom in return for military service. Their first action was in the siege of British-held Savannah, Georgia in autumn 1779, and the unit was disbanded in 1782. All three regiments had Black private soldiers with white command staff. So now we'll return to the Continental Army. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were written for the Declaration of Independence, Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans had been fighting 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army and States Militia. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. At the onset of the War for Independence, approximately 500,000 African Americans lived in the colonies, of whom some 450,000 were enslaved. Blacks fought in provincial regiments prior to the war, and roughly 5,000 African American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served the revolutionary cause. While accurate numbers are hard to come by, the American population at the time was approximately some 2.1 million. Using those accepted estimates, free blacks comprised 2.4% of the population, and while slaves formed 21.5%. And keep those numbers in mind as we go on. We'll get back to numbers a little bit later. Before we go into an overview of early service, let's discuss Black soldiers' motivation for joining the Continental Army. Those reasons were many and varied, and most mirrored those of their fellow white and Indian soldiers.
Excuse me, John. I apologize for interrupting.
Sure.
We've had a request that you could maybe speak a little bit more slowly.
Sure.
It can be a little harder to understand things in a virtual environment than it would be in person.
Sure.
Thanks. We appreciate it.
The reasons for joining were many and varied, and most mirrored those of their fellow and white Indian soldiers. Some, perhaps many, joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected to the prospect of serving alongside family or friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. Many fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in the new country. Forced service was another factor. If they were on militia rolls, both white and black men were periodically faced with the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in a Continental regiment. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their master to serve. Some were promised freedom in return, and most of those were freed after being discharged, but a few were kept in bondage. Of course, the major dividing line between white and black common soldiers was the American system of enslaving huge numbers of Africans and African Americans. So now we'll turn to an overview of early service. Black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militiamen of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside their black comrades on April 19, 1775. To date, we have the names of 35 black men present that day, at least 18 seeing combat. One, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's company on Lexington Green. 2 months later, at least 88 black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have served at the Bunker Hill Battle. One historian estimates the total may have been as high as 150, roughly 5% of American troops involved. There are several mentions of black participants in those early actions, but this is my favorite, speaking to the courage and resilience of African American soldiers, and the effect one man's determination had on another. Massachusetts soldier John Greenwood, a white soldier, noted of that day, "Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. As I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill, it was filled with chairs and wagons, bearing the wounded and dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and his shirt collar being open, he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers. I saw the wound quite plainly, and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt much. He said no, that he was only going to get a plaster put on it and meant to return." Greenwood continued, "You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war." So you can see the effect of the bravery of one soldier, in this case, an African-American soldier, on another soldier as he heads into battle. Despite the proven ability, African-Americans were early on deemed unfit for continental service. A May 1775 Massachusetts provincial resolution stated that no slaves be admitted into this army upon any consideration whatsoever. By contrast, in October 1775, Council of Officers agreed to unanimously reject all slaves, and by a great majority reject Negroes altogether. While November 12 Army orders directed neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. At the end of December, General George Washington signaled a change of policy, saying that numbers of free Negroes who are desirous of enlisting and gave leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. So given the desperate need to fill Continental regiments, that was soon amended to include all free blacks in the American Army began as and remained a racially integrated organization to the war's end. But despite the inclusion and acceptance of African-American soldiers in the ranks, little to no indication of animus from white soldiers, Black Continentals were generally allowed only to serve as musicians and privates, and at least in their early war years, may have been channeled into such roles as waiter or laborer more often than white comrades. That said, whites, according to my studies, white soldiers served as waiters just as much as African-American soldiers, basically throughout the war. Having said all that, Black musket-bearing soldiers fought in every major battle of the war and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. A number of American officers and congressmen noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably, with the claim that they were unsuited to be soldiers. But we'll concentrate on the positive because there was more positive than negative. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about Black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, Adams called them unsuitable for service. General William Heath replied, there are in the Massachusetts regiment some few lads and old men, and in several regiments some Negroes. Such is also the case with the regiments from the other colonies. Rhode Island has a number of Negroes and Indians. Connecticut has fewer Negroes but a number of Indians. The New Hampshire regiments have less of both. The men from Connecticut, I think in general, are rather stouter than those of either of the other colonies, but the troops of our colony are robust, agile, and as fine fellows in general as I would ever wish to see in the field. General John Thomas was more emphatic. In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men, for fatigue and inaction. Many of them have proved themselves brave. Foreign officers were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, "The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence, you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them." And French Baron Ludwig von Closen wrote in July 1781, and this is a quote that's wonderful for a lot of reasons. He noted, "I had a chance to see the American Army man for man. It is really painful to see those brave men almost naked, with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly." Now, let's look a bit at numbers. And I don't want to spend too much time on numbers, but they are important. Here we have the August 1778 return of, it was actually called the Return of Negroes in the Army. It's a return of 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. There were 755 African Americans in a force totaling almost 18,000 rank and file. That's sergeants, corporals, music, and private soldiers, making African-American soldiers 4.2% of the whole. Now, while that proportion may seem small to some, by themselves, soldiers of color would form two understrength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most serving Continental regiments. But as it was, they were all integrated within the other regiments. Additionally, let's recall that free blacks form 2.4% of the overall American population. You can see, so considering numbers of slaves who served, even considering numbers of slaves who served, free African Americans were well represented in proportion to their numbers in the population. New Jersey and Rhode Island are the only states not represented in the return that had units serving with Washington's army. The number of blacks serving in New Jersey's 4 Continental regiments is uncertain, but likely no more than 20 during the entire war. Rhode Island had just reconstituted one of its regiments, the 1st, filling it with African American and Indian private soldiers, mostly former slaves. In August 1778, that unit contained 146 privates. So adding those men would bring the total to about 916 African American soldiers in the Army that month. So we can play with those numbers a little bit. First, let's look at the highest proportions of black soldiers in the highest 6 brigades. I'll just mention the top 3. Parsons, Connecticut had 9.3%. Muhlenberg, Virginia Brigade had 8.5%, and the North Carolina Brigade had 6.5%. So you can see of the top 6 highest brigades with African Americans in the ranks, 3 were from the North, 3 were from the South. And those percentages are higher than the Army return of 4.2%. So again, playing with the numbers a little more, we can figure out the average of Black soldiers in a regiment. Again, Parsons, Connecticut had 37 Black soldiers per regiment, so they would have been split up between 8 companies. North Carolina had 29 Black soldiers per regiment, and Massachusetts regiment had 22, almost 23%, or 23 Black soldiers per regiment. And now we go to how the Army looked. Now, this is just a company. There's a modern image of a single company of Henley's Additional Regiment in 1779. It's a good representation of how many Continental companies would have appeared, with some having a few more Black soldiers and others none at all. As can be seen, the proportion of African Americans may be considered rather small, but that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued into the mid-19th century. More importantly, foreign observers and others likely considered African Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement, almost on a par with the Declaration of Independence and taking up arms against the King's Army. It may have been an unintentional and to some an unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and just as pragmatic arming of Blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. So now we'll turn to the individual stories of 2 soldiers. And these come from the 19th century pension narratives, which was called the Pension Narrative Project. It's called by historian John C. Dan, one of the largest oral history projects ever taken. Jacob Francis was born in New Jersey and eventually served in the Massachusetts Continental Regiment for 1 year, and then in the New Jersey Militia from 1777 to the war's end. Francis was born in January 1754 and testified, "When I was of age, I was bound as an indentured servant by my mother, a colored woman, to one Henry Wambile in Amwell, New Jersey. His indenture was sold to 3 other masters, the last time at a little over 13 years of age to Joseph Saxton, who took him to New York, then to an island in the Caribbean, then back to Salem, Massachusetts, where he was sold 1 more time. And again, he was indentured. He was not enslaved for life. He was indentured servant. In January 1775, his indenture ended, having served his last master for, according to Francis, 6 years, or until I was 21 years of age. Still living in Salem, Jacob Francis enlisted in autumn 1775 for 1 year in Sergeant's 16th Continental Regiment, belonging to Massachusetts. During that time, he served at the Boston Siege and witnessed the battles of Long Island and White Plains. A short time after the fall of Fort Lee on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, Francis and his comrades marched across New Jersey, crossed the river into Pennsylvania, and then marched down to a camp off from the Delaware River a few miles below Corriell's Ferry and above Howell's Ferry, where we lay there a week or 2. And that's actually the upper portion of what is now Washington's Crossing State Park in Pennsylvania. In his pension application, Jacob described the 26 December 1776 attack on the Hessians at Trenton. He wrote, and rather accurately too, "We received orders to march on Christmas night, crossed at the Delaware River down to Trenton early in the morning. Entered the west end of town. General Washington came into the north end of town. We marched down the street from the river road into the town to the corner where it crosses the street running out towards the Scotch Road and turned up that street. General Washington was at the head of that street coming down towards us, and some of the Hessians were between us. And there we had the fight, and the principal firing was. After about half an hour, the firing ceased. General Lord Sterling rode up to Colonel Sargent and conversed with him. We were ordered to follow him across the creek onto the north side of it. We were formed in line in view of the Hessians who were paraded on the south side. Being hemmed in, the Hessians surrendered, grounded their arms, and left them there, and marched down to the old ferry below the Assunpink between Trenton and Lumberton, where they were ferried across to the Pennsylvania side." Private Francis soon ended his Continental Army career, being discharged at Trenton soon after the battle. The remainder of Francis's lengthy deposition recounts his militia career, which is much too long to recount here. But he did state, "I always went out when it came to my turn to the end of the war, and went out once as a substitute for a person who could not, and gave me $45 Continental money to take his place." A side note, In 1789, Jacob Francis struck another small blow for freedom. Former slave Phyllis Duncan testified she was present and saw Mary Francis married to Jacob Francis by Cato Finley. At the time of said marriage, Phyllis and Mary Francis and Cato Finley all lived with and were the slaves of Nathaniel Hunt, where the marriage took place. Jacob Francis, immediately after his marriage to Mary, bought Mary from her master. Mary, in a few days, left the employ of Hunt and went with her husband, and they have ever since that time, lived together as man and wife up until the death of Jacob and raised a family of children. So sometimes there were happy endings. Of all the Black Virginia Continental soldiers found for my study, Andrew Pebbles had the most varied career. In his pension testimony, he noted that he didn't recall the year he enlisted, being a poor, unlearned mulatto. But according to my research, he actually enlisted in September 1777. Pebbles testified that he joined the camp at Valley Forge and was placed under the command of Captain Lewis Booker, 11th Virginia Regiment, for 2 years. At Trenton, he served 1 year in the artillery. For a part of the year he was under Captain William Miller, who commanded the gun with 12 men to which he belonged. He served 2 years under Captain Michael Rudolph of Maryland in the light infantry commanded by Colonel Harry Lee. And that's actually Henry Lee, who was the father of Robert E. Lee. Lee's command was composed of infantry and cavalry, Lee's Legion. He was in 3 general actions: at Monmouth, Guilford Courthouse, and at Eutaw Springs. At Eutaw Springs, he received 3 wounds. He was wounded in the shoulder, slightly lost the thumb of the left hand, and was bayoneted in the belly. He was discharged on the Combahee River honorably. The day before he was discharged, he was in the battle in which Colonel John Lawrence, who commanded in the absence of Colonel Lee, was killed. That's would have been 27 August 1782. Peoples, too, though a free man, had to deal with the issue of slavery post-war. In his pension, he testified, "By occupation, I'm a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I'm not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 50 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, aged 11 years." Several other Virginia veterans told of enslaved family members when they applied for pensions in the early 19th century. Thomas Mahorny was a planter on a little farm, not his. His family residing with him are as follows: his wife Maima and his son Jack, both of which are slaves. He, Thomas Mahorny, being a free man who served in the War of the Revolution and is unassisted by the labor of his family. Drury Scott noted, "My occupation is that of a rough carpenter, but I can get but little work. If I had more, I could not do it. My wife is all my family, but being a slave can render me no assistance." So that was one big difference between white and Black soldiers. Even for free Black soldiers, slavery still affected their lives. The unit most associated with African-American soldiers is the so-called Black 1st Rhode Island Regiment. In reality, it existed only from March 1778 to June 1780, 2 years and 4 months. It was never large enough to form a full regiment, and because of that, never served with Washington's main army until after the unit joined the second Rhode Island in 1781, when they were consolidated to form a single unit, the Rhode Island Regiment. Little is certainly known of African-American numbers in the early war Rhode Island regiments, 1775 to 76. But Massachusetts General Heath noted in 1775, "The regiments of Rhode Island have a number of Negroes and Indians." All the Rhode Island regiments from 1775 through 77 contained Black soldiers serving alongside the white comrades. With the Continental Army 1777 rebirth, only the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments remained, recruited with men enlisted or re-enlisted for 3 years of the duration of the war. The Rhode Island regiments were particularly hard hit during the 1777 campaign, and the state had to consider how to recruit them. Brigadier General James Varnum recommended in 1778 that a battalion of Negroes be raised in Rhode Island. That February, the state legislature resolved that any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist into either of the 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the war. It was eventually determined that these recruits would join only the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that unit would contain only Black or Native American privates, with white commissioned officers, sergeants, and corporals. Governor Cook noted in late February, the number of slaves in this state is not great, but there is generally thought that 300 and upwards will be enlisted. He was actually overly optimistic in this. Any slaves accepted received their freedom, and their owners were remunerated. Unpopular with many residents, in early May, the legislature set a June 1778 cutoff for slave recruiting, though free Blacks continued to enlist. So given that law, and despite Governor Cook's assurances, or at least the cutoff of the law, at best less than 150 African Americans ever joined the 1st Regiment, and was never able to form a full battalion. While the 1st Rhode Island Regiment command staff were recruiting slaves in their home state, the regiment's enlisted personnel remained at Valley Forge and were incorporated into the 2nd Regiment. At the same time, the veteran Black soldiers from both regiments were formed into a single segregated company under Captain Thomas Arnold. Arnold's large company, which by spring 1778 had 60 privates, Black and Indian privates, mostly Black, belonged to the absent 1st Regiment, but while with the main army fielded with Colonel Israel Angle's 2nd Rhode Island. So this is actually a little known incident, actually, that a company of Black soldiers, all Black soldiers, fought at the Battle of Monmouth. Very few people know this. When Washington's forces confronted the British at the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, Captain Arnold's Black company marched to Monmouth Courthouse with Varnum's brigade in Major General Charles Lee's advance force. Early in the action, Lee's men retreated in the face of superior forces, withdrawing towards Washington's marching troops. Meeting the main army's van, General Lee encountered Washington, who placed Lee in charge of an ad hoc holding action. Lieutenant Colonel only described the Rhode Island troops during the ensuing defense. So this included the Black company. After retiring something more than a mile, General Varnum's brigade was ordered to halt and form by a cross fence to cover 2 pieces of artillery, which were in danger of being lost. And this is actually a pretty famous holding action. It was called the hedgerow at the Battle of Monmouth. We there exchanged about 10 rounds and were then obliged to retire with considerable loss, but not until the enemy had outflanked us and advanced with charged bayonets to the fence by which we had formed. Our brigade suffered more than any that was engaged. But the enemy did not pursue us far in our retreat, observing our army formed in the heights in our rear. Captain Arnold's leg was amputated as a result of his wound at Monmouth, and one of Arnold's men, Richard Rhodes, related in the 19th century, he's very much crippled in one arm in consequence of a wound received at the Battle of Monmouth. He was born in Africa, brought to this country and sold as a slave, and enlisted in the Black Regiment to obtain his freedom. Arnold's company joined the 1st Rhode Island in July 1778, and the so-called Black Regiment went on to see combat at the August 1778 Battle of Rhode Island, and remained in their home state until marching into New York to be consolidated with the 2nd Regiment in 1881. Before we continue, I want to briefly discuss the treatment of African American soldiers. Regarding equal treatment at the most basic level, Continental Army soldiers of color, both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. They suffered together in times of scarcity and jointly enjoyed the rare times of bounty. Were there difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' personal or race animus? Yeah, I'm pretty sure there was, but to my knowledge, such instances were very few and far between. One incident is telling. A white Rhode Islander, Abner Simmons, recalled in 1780 when the 2 remaining Black regiment companies were joined with an understrength and integrated Rhode Island 6-month levy regiment. Simmons wrote, Captain Elijah Lewis commanded the Black Company, which actually 2 companies, which took post on the right of the Rhode Island 6-month levy regiment. The right of the regiment was the place of honor, and in this case was accorded to the 2 Black companies, which you would not see in the 19th century or the 20th century, or most of the 20th century at least. So, speaking of Rhode Island soldiers, and with the 1778 Army return in mind, we'll look at the numbers for the Black Regiment throughout the war. In October 1777, just after the hard-fought Battle of Red Bank, the two Rhode Island regiments contained 369 musicians and privates, including 65 African-American soldiers. At that time, Black soldiers amounted to 17.5% of rank and file strength, larger than any proportion of either the entire 1778 return or any of the brigade strengths. The Black Regiment, when it became the Black Regiment, which existed from March 1778 to June 1780, in August 1778, the regiment contained 137 Black soldiers, plus 5 Indians and 4 with mixed Indian African American blood, which at that time were called mustees. By September 1779, it had 147 soldiers of color. And in June 1780, with only 124 Black and Indian soldiers, the unit was formed into 2 large companies and attached to an understrength Rhode Island Levy Battalion. After it was consolidated with the 2nd Rhode Island in 1781 to form the Rhode Island Regiment, there was a regimental return on September 4th, 1780. Those 2 large companies numbered 108 private soldiers. And when this return was taken, they were on their way to Yorktown, Virginia to take part in the siege. Now, adding Black musicians and soldiers on other duty, at that date, Black soldiers comprised 29% of the regiment. So again, it's about 9.3% was the highest percentage on the brigade, 1778 brigade return. In 1781, you had 29% of the Rhode Island Regiment were Black soldiers. And before we move on, just a bit more about this unit. The segregated segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment was an outlier, an experiment born of necessity in an army of integrated units. The experiment was largely unsuccessful, but through no fault of its own. The fact that the regiment remained seriously understrength for the entire term of its existence was largely due to the legislature cutting off slave enlistment with only 4 months after it was begun. Still, in the 19th century, the Black Regiment became a symbol and example of African-American ability as soldiers and was seen by many as the precursor to the United States colored regiments that were formed during our Civil War. So now I want to see how slavery could affect even free Blacks, both during and after the war. So first we'll go to during the war. And this is actually back to the Rhode Island Regiment. It's a soldier, it actually affects them. A late war soldier-civilian confrontation emphasizes the perils Black soldiers were exposed to even from their fellow revolutionaries. Private Fortune Stoddard began his military career with the integrated Rhode Island 1780 6-month state battalion. Re-enlisting in the 1781 Rhode Island Regiment that December after the Yorktown siege, he and a number of other Rhode Island soldiers were quartered on the 1st floor of a home at Head of Elk, Maryland. Upstairs, a group of seamen were celebrating. Inebriated, their Captain James Cunningham descended to the 1st floor and commenced abusing the soldiers, particularly Stoddard, who he assaulted with his fists and a small round chair. Private Stoddard called on the captain to cease. At that point, a Connecticut captain, Ebenezer Wales, entered and confronted Cunningham, who in turn threatened Wales. Wales then had the soldiers oust the seamen at the point of the bayonet, but that was not the end of it. Cunningham and his men returned the next day and demanded alcohol from the homeowner, which she refused. The sound of breaking furniture drew 2 unarmed Rhode Islanders upstairs. One was knocked to the floor, and Benjamin Blanchard, a white private, retreated downstairs. So here we see that quartered in the same house were both white and Black soldiers. So it's another indication of how they, how Blacks and whites got along together in the army. When the seamen followed Blanchard down, the rest of the soldiers were readied with loaded muskets and fixed bayonets. One white private aimed at Captain Cunningham's chest, but a seaman seized the weapon from the soldier, upon which the captain grabbed it and struck the soldier's head. At this, Private Stoddard fired, hitting Cunningham in the groin, a wound that proved mortal. Fortune Stoddard was arrested and tried for murder in a Cecil County, Maryland civil court. He was eventually convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to be branded, specifically burnt in the brawn of the left thumb with a hot iron. That being done, Stoddard was still required to pay court costs, but not having the funds to do so, he remained confined. Finally, the county government settled on the solution that he be sold into slavery. This is a free man being sold into slavery to pay his debt. Fortunately, the Rhode Island commander brought the case to Washington's attention. 8 months after the incident, the Congress decided that The state of Maryland be requested to discharge from confinement Fortune Stoddard, a soldier belonging to the Rhode Island Regiment, confined for costs accrued in a late prosecution, and charge such costs to the United States, in order that the same be charged to the said soldier and deducted out of his pay. Now, Fortune Stoddard never reappeared on his regiment's muster rolls, and he was still a prisoner in 1782. I do have a record of that. So he was possibly confined to the war's end. He did eventually return to Rhode Island and lived in Newport, where he married, raised a family, and by 1805 was working as a chimney sweep. Now, I just want to sidetrack to basically an almost exactly the same case that happened in the Rhode Island Regiment in 1780, when a black soldier on guard at night fired and killed a white civilian who was harassing him, and he went through all the military procedures. That soldier too was charged with murder, convicted of manslaughter. He had to pay a fine. He was burnt on the thumb, and that thumb, or that burning on the thumb branding on the thumb is actually it's a common sentence at that time for even white citizens. So as horrible as it sounds, it really during the period it was actually pretty common. But that soldier at that time, and the soldier in 1780 was released. He was released back to his company. Never went to jail. So obviously, either he or somebody was able to pay his fine for him. Stoddard couldn't pay his fine and was threatened with slavery. So to reiterate, the most telling and horrifying result of the trial is the Cecil County government's suggestion that Fortune Stoddard be sold into slavery to pay the owed court costs. Beyond any other opinions on the matter, no white soldier could be subjected to the same, quote, solution. So I do have a small section on African-American women with the Army. So I want to speak a little bit about them right now. And basically they served with the Army of their own free will, sometimes by the will of others. And to correct the popular idea of Army women, black and white, they were by and large respectable and respected. Any women that were not long tolerated. I discovered a number of black women with the Army, some of them servants. One of those was Hannah Till, who served in General Washington's household and gave birth to a son at Valley Forge. Another was Rachel, a slave who stole herself and joined the 1st Maryland Regiment in 1778. But I really want to focus on one woman, Judith Lines, and read a portion of the only known surviving letter written home by a black soldier during the war, published for the first time in my book. To preface the letter, John Lines enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point and other Hudson Highland posts. By Judith Lines' own testimony, they married in 1780. She recalled the next summer after I married, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands. At that time, my husband was a waiter for Colonel Sherman, and while at the camp, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months. Mrs. Lines noted in a pension application, my husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, in which I give to the magistrate who takes my deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband. Now the letter. I take this opportunity to send to you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment, Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter now, how you have lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed that cow, or whether you've got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see you myself, then I could talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death. So this letter tells us a lot, as does the rest of the information in the pension application. I mean, Judith Lines, she served with the Army even only a short time, but she had smallpox during that period. If anybody's familiar with smallpox, it's a horrific disease, and she survived, though she may have been scarred on the face, which was pretty common with the disease. She was at home basically taking care of the household and the children by herself. And also her husband could write. I don't know the incidence of how many African Americans could write, but a lot of white soldiers couldn't write. Especially, I mean, you can tell that just by reading their pension applications when they sign an X instead of their name. So all in all, it's a remarkable letter and also a remarkable service. So in closing, Lines and other veterans returned home to a changed and changing nation. Despite the waning of Northern slavery with the ratification of the 1789 United States Constitution and boosted by the 1794 cotton gin patent, Black bondage was cemented as a political and economic fact, and detrimental racial attitudes hardened before, but more especially after 1800. 35 years after the war, Black Revolutionary veterans, along with their white comrades, were eligible for service pensions. But even in that system, they experienced the effect of increasing bias. When all is said and done, African American military service was a direct challenge to slavery and the racial construct, and an affront to many white citizens. Still, Black Americans continued to fight for their nation, as 81-year-old Judith Lines related in 1837. My youngest son died of a wound received in the last war, the War of 1812. His name was Benjamin. The wound was received at the Battle of Chippewa in July 1814. And Black Revolutionary veterans remain proud of their service, as attested by Artillo Freeman, who in the tally of his belongings totaled the whole at $15.75. At the end of the list, he added one more item: Revolutionary uniform, invaluable. And to put a period to my talk, former Private Henry Hallowell, a white soldier, a white veteran of the 5th Massachusetts Regiment, gave this simple but fitting tribute to African American soldiers, free and slave, who served in the revolutionary cause in a number of roles. In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Pomp Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers. So before we go to questions, I just want to let you know that, well, first of all, I'll give you my email. If you have a pen, or maybe Kate might want to pass it on too. My email is ju_Rees, R-E-E-S, at msn.com. That's ju_Rees at msn.com. As R-E-E-S. And you can write me with any questions you may have. And here are also 2 more online sources you can look for more information. One is a blog I've done, and another one is a file I compiled of sources. And with that, my presentation is done.
All right. Thank you so much, John. It's wonderful to hear all of this. It's quite a fascinating history. We have gotten at least one question so far.
Okay.
And I'd invite anyone else who's watching this live to go ahead and type any questions that you want to into the Q&A box. So I have agreed to voice the questions to John, since as the host, I'm the one who can see them on my screen. Kathleen wants to know, are there any first-person accounts of Native Americans?
That's something I have not looked into, but I'm sure that in the pension files that there are some pensions of Native Americans. There was a well-known Indian company of Stockbridge Indians, and they were actually Massachusetts soldiers who were taken out to form this special company of Indians. And their history is actually quite interesting. Unfortunately, they only served for a short time because they were pretty much decimated in a really small battle outside of New York. But there were a number of Native Americans who served in pretty much all the regiments, pretty much every state line. And that's something I might want to do sometime. I might want to actually look into the Native American pensions too, to see what I can find out about their service. But that's a great question, it really is.
Yeah. And so Lorna wants to know, were there Black soldiers among the British from their colonies or elsewhere? What was the highest rank obtained by a Black soldier?
Well, in the American Army, the highest rank attained There may have been a Virginia sergeant who was African American. He left a pension, and I've seen some other records, but I can't nail down whether he actually was a sergeant, because there are two soldiers, and I don't know if they're both the same man or one is white and one is black. But the highest known rank attained in the Continental Army was corporal, and that was only for a short period of time. There were Native American corporals and sergeants, and that would have been in that Indian company that I mentioned. In the British Army, pretty much African Americans were relegated to either serving as waiters or serving as musicians. So they would have been either fifers and drummers, or in a band. They could have been in a band too. They did have military bands. In the loyalist troops, in the regular loyalist troops, they were basically relegated to being musicians too, even though there was at least one black soldier in Butler's Rangers on the frontier, and there may have been more. So there were some exceptions. In a really interesting exception, and he wasn't a regular loyalist regiment. It was actually basically an irregular unit. It was called the Black Brigade. It was a loyalist unit that served out of Sandy Hook Lighthouse in New Jersey, and they were led by a man named Colonel Ty. His name was Titus. He had escaped from his master in New Jersey. The story goes, and it hasn't been confirmed, that the story goes that he escaped and went down and joined the Ethiopian regiment in Virginia, which was only lasted a year. And then he came back north, and he formed an irregular unit, which was actually both black and white loyal soldiers. His nickname was Colonel Ty. It wasn't an official rank, but he led that group, so he was an unofficial colonel, and he served for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, and then he was killed in action. But his is a really interesting story. Other than that, like I said, in the American Army, they were relegated to serving as privates, and the same in loyalist militias or regular units too. But that should do that.
Okay, and kind of a related question. Samantha wants to know, did Black soldiers qualify for pensions if they were not enslaved?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, it's interesting because by and large, and especially in the North, I'm not sure so much in the South, but I have seen enslaved soldiers who served in the South, and they weren't supposed to serve, but a lot of times they served instead of their master. And they did receive their freedom, especially in the North. They received their freedom after service. There were some times when their masters went back on their promise, but eventually, usually in those cases, the slaves were served at some point after the war. And yes, they were entitled to pensions. In 1785, I think about 1785, Virginia passed a law where they would free any slaves who had contributed to the war effort, and that included those who had served as soldiers and never received their freedom, but it also included slaves who worked in the salt mines or other war-related efforts. I mean, the salt was a really important commodity, and especially when you're trying to raise an army, it was a food preservative, so it was hugely important for an army. So Virginia did free some slaves after the war for their service.
And so then Lorna says, I met a descendant of a Black Revolutionary soldier in Halifax, Nova Scotia, who I assume served with the Loyalists. Were there any Black soldiers in the American Army who were not given their freedom who moved to Canada?
If they may have run away and done so, yes, because as we know, during the 19th century, it was very common for slaves to, when they ran away, they headed north, and some of them did not stop in the northern states. They kept on going to Canada. But immediately after the war, during the war, like the Ethiopian regiment under Dunmore, he basically went around and raided plantations and stole slaves, and that's where he had the idea to start a Black regiment, because he had so many ex-slaves. As the war continued, slaves flocked either into New York, British-held New York, or when Cornwallis was in the South, they flocked to his army. Basically, they stole themselves. They stole themselves from their masters and joined the British, or they went into British-held Savannah or Charleston. And those slaves, at the end of the war were sent. Most of them were sent to Canada. Some were sent to the West Indies. Some actually made their way back to England. Some were resettled in Africa. So there was a relatively large African American population that was transported to Nova Scotia, mostly after the war. And unfortunately, they weren't really that well treated up there, unfortunately. But there's also a lot of descendants that are still there. So, slaves got their freedom by running into the British. Again, it was a complicated war and really interesting.
Yeah, so William asks, what pieces of material culture from Black patriots do you find the most interesting or important to remembering their service?
Well, there's the Museum of the American Revolution, and it will be on display at some point. They have the powder horn of a Black soldier. He was probably in the militia. He fought at the Battle of Wyoming, which was actually a massacre. I mean, he was actually killed there. And the only reason he was, I think he actually served, I think, in the French and Indian War too. I can't remember his. I actually have a photograph of the horn in my study here, but I'm not close enough to read it. I have a picture of it in my book, and the only reason his body was identified after that massacre, after that battle, was his powder horn was with his body. There are some other interesting artifacts up in the Hubbardton Museum, Battle of Hubbardton up in Vermont. There are some belongings that a Black soldier carried during that battle. They're pretty mundane, but still, he carried them, into the military service. And there has to be some other ones, but one of the most moving and ones that, as far as I know, did not survive is that one that the soldier talked about his revolutionary uniform being invaluable. So in the 1830s, he still had his uniform. What happened to it? It probably, unfortunately, ended up in the rag bin, and that's really sad.
I had a note here from one of my colleagues in the museum to supply the name. His name is Gershom Prince.
Oh yes, yeah, right, yes. Thank you. Thanks for reminding me.
All right. Hollis has a question. What areas of research are left to explore to uncover more information? Are there institutions that have collections or records that require extensive time for research?
Yes. I can't recall right off the top of my head institutions where, I mean, basically the pension files are still full of great material. I only accessed a certain number of them. I mean, I found huge numbers of them, and then I had to cull them down into some of the most interesting accounts. But I'm still finding pension accounts that I missed, and there's still a lot of. I mean, I'm still researching the subject, which is why I still have the blog to support the book and just share more information. I mean, African American women in the Army. I would love to find more women who serve with the Army. I'd still love to find more information on treatment, their treatment during the war, because it seems that they were very well treated. I mean, they were treated more or less equally with white soldiers, which changed again starting after the war, but more especially 1800 and after it really changed. But yeah, there are a lot of. Hopefully, there are still tidbits out there that remain yet to be discovered about Black American service. Since I mentioned the Museum of the American Revolution, I mean, even before that opened, but especially after that opened, new material has been coming out of the woodwork. I mean, not just about Black soldiers, but about, I mean, people were opening their attics and opening their family collections. So it's amazing that the amount of material that is yet unknown or was unknown that's coming out. So I remain optimistic and look forward to learning more. I really do. Great.
Well, we've had a question on the last one. Kathleen, actually, it's a question really more for the DAR, wanting to know what research the institution has done on some of these patriots and their ancestors and drawing in more women of color.
Mhm.
And as someone who works in the museum, I am actually not connected to the genealogy side of things. And so I would refer you then to the DAR website, www.dar.org. And that's where you'll find the museum side of things, where I work. It's a decorative arts museum, so we have the stuff. And then there's the genealogy side of things, and they do, I believe they do list a fair number of resources that you can take a look at, and contact information too.
And I want to plug the DAR too, because there's the collection by Eric Grunset. I forget the name of the collection, but it's basically soldiers of color, so it includes Native Americans too. And you can go through that collection. It's available as a PDF. You can download it and use it at home. And it has, if a man has a pension file, it's listed on his individual entry. That was a wonderful resource for me when I was writing my book, and that's available through the DAR. So I highly recommend that. I think it might be called Forgotten Soldiers. But
yeah. We did. The museum did have an exhibit many years ago called Forgotten Patriots, and that focused on patriots of color, Black, Native American, and women who were involved as well in the war. And so there are a fair number of resources on the DAR's website, and so I hope you'll all take a look at what we've got. Well, that's it for the moment for questions. So thank you again so much, John. We really appreciated having you here. And
well, I want to thank you very much too, and thanks for everybody that joined.
All right, wonderful. Well, take care, everyone. Hope you all do well, and please do check out the website for upcoming events.